give you a keynote from the commercial gaming perspective. Arjun Sethi is the CEO of LOL Apps. They currently run a Facebook application called Ravenwood Fair, which is a sim Renaissance fair application. I believe they have 25 million users. And he's going to talk about, what's the commercial path and what's the commercial reality now for people in the industry who are developing and maintaining and growing a new generation of commercial games.
Morning, everybody. I'm going to grab some water. I don't have my speech is going to be a little bit more impromptu. On my way here, I thought about how this presentation was going to happen. And I was thinking if I talked specifically about games, it might get too detailed, but I'll just slide my way into how we sort of think about making games and how we also think about making social entertainment products, because games at the end of the day for us is just a facet of entertainment. So just to give a little bit of background about who I am. Today I sort of advise a bunch of companies. Groupon, Facebook, Google are part of them. And the way that I think about products and the way that a lot of people that I work with think about products is how do we build a product that is social at its foundation, and then how do we grow it from there? And I've been in the industry for about 10 years in Silicon Valley. And what ends up happening is that we sort of think about growing products organically and trying to find influencers and trying to find a way so that we're not spending on marketing. We're sort of using myself or you and I, or someone who has, let's just say, a very sort of a strong will, or people listen to them. And in our industry, we call them influencers, or sort of nodes that sort of carry on and grow an application. My history is I'm from around the area. I grew up here. I went to school here for economics and history, based in University of Maryland. And sort of the time that I spent here, and one of the reasons why I moved back, was that I majored in Middle Eastern history. And from that, there was a lot of movements that sort of resonated with me in terms of like the Muslim Brotherhood and like Egypt, how they sort of broadcasted. And so the way that social networking works is it's sort of similar. It's at its root cause, it's sort of communication. And every product that you build is communication oriented. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So the traditional methods of communication, I'll just go back to, I'm going to go back, for our space, 10 years is 50 years. So just going back to 99, like the methods of communication during that time was just the emergence of SMS, it was the emergence of email, and it was the emergence of like communication on the internet. So how many people are familiar with BBS, or the bulletin board services? Okay, that's good. I don't feel old then. And then obviously the telephone as well. So everyone sort of communicates in some way or some fashion, and every generation changes the way that they communicate. During my generation, I started communicating more by SMS and email. And the communication today, like my younger sister, she doesn't have email. All she communicates is by SMS and Facebook. For them, email is like, it doesn't exist. And then over time, what's been happening is that social networking, or as a generation has been changing, and the way that they communicate globally is also changing. So, of course, the last person that came up here was talking about how they communicate. Like in the Asia, India, China, it's mostly SMS related, and it's mostly just through the mobile phone. But they're also communicating through applications, is what we call it today, but it's just web portals. Twitter being amongst one of them. Twitter's like really popular in Japan. There's clones of that in India and Taiwan, etc., and sort of their own facets, their own versions. And so again, when we've been building products on the open web. 2020 is going to be hindsight. We're going to say like that's how we thought about it. At that time, we just thought about how we were going to grow these things. But at the underlying foundation is that how do we think about building our products, or how do we think about building something that's going to be entertainment or enjoyable for the audience that we have. And so, again, started on the internet, and then we went to social networking. I'll tell you how this sort of evolved. Today, what you see is self-expression. People are very public with what they talk about. They might have thousands of followers. They might have 3 followers. It just depends on how relevant they are. It could be relative to their high school. It could be relative to religious areas. It could be relative to specific types of things that are happening in a local area. Of course, when Obama got elected, it might seem that they spend a lot of money on marketing, but if you sort of look at how our generation, or the generation that's a little bit younger than me, thought about his campaign seemed very organic and seemed very real. And so when we're building products and we're building it for the global audience, we think about it in the same way: is how do we sort of broadcast a product, or how do we get it out there to a certain audience without working too hard? And that seems a little counterintuitive, but what I mean by that is that I'm picking a certain person in this audience, and I feel that they're important somehow. And I take their importance and I leverage that and say, like, I want to try to use you to grow my application, grow my product, or grow my service at the end of the day. It's similar to how Groupon works. It's very similar to how Facebook started. And to a certain extent, it's very similar to how Twitter also sort of grew. And it's very broadcast-oriented. We've gone from broadcast to private networks to public networks to broadcast again. And today it's a lot about self-expression. And games is a part of that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But in every part of the world, it's a very different type of broadcast, and it's a very different type of expression. This is today on Facebook. I'm not sure if they publicly announced some of it, but there's essentially about between 600 and 700 million active users per month. This is just global, worldwide. As a company, and again, I'll talk a little bit more about what LOL Apps is, but I mean, my whole company exists on the Facebook platform. It's about 90% of our business. It's about 90% of our social interactions, and it's about 90% of all the applications and games that we build on Facebook today. And so, has anybody seen this graph before of the Facebook connections? Okay, just one guy in the back. Essentially, you can see that China doesn't exist in this model. But this is basically all the connections and the nodes of the connections that exist in this Facebook space. And what you can see, there's a lot of direct correlations between Eastern United States, UK. There's a lot of correlations between India, UK, India, Australia, India, Philippines, Australia, Mexico, Southern United States. And so when we think about the amount of data that we have when we're building these applications and we're growing our user base, we have a lot of data to, instead of being reactive to our customers or reactive to the global audience, we can be very proactive. We can see what they like, what they don't like, how they're interacting with the space, how as a community they're interacting, and how I can sort of tailor my products for that community, or tailor specific parts of the product to different communities and have them come into the game very differently, or come into the applications differently. Part of that is localization. Does anybody know what I mean by localization? Okay, I'll just explain it real quick. When we started off in the industry, localization just meant that we would just take a very dumb version of translations and we just slap it onto our products. Today, that means it's something very different. Localization basically means that, let's just say our game Ravenwood Fair, it's about building sort of a sim game. Or sim buildings, and the type of innuendos I use here in the United States don't work in Brazil. So, like, if I have a Mother's Day holiday pack or something very specific catered to that campaign, that's not going to work in Brazil. They're going to look at that and say, "This is, I don't really care." So, localization basically means for each and every single country or specific area, it's more culturally dependent. We'll sort of look at that. So we have, like, the Easter pack was very relative to Christian countries. For Muslim countries, it wasn't. So we had more Ramadan flows during their time frame. So it might be the same product, but the way that those users interact with the product itself are going to be very different, and their experience is going to be completely different. So going back to this, there's just a huge amount of cross-pollination of users on Facebook. And the way that information spreads is it's very viral and it's very infectious. And that's what we study all day long, is how do we figure out a way to make our products viral and infectious at the end of the day. And for each and every geography and each and every location, it's very different. Philippines is a great example. At the end of the day, the United States has sort of like an ADD problem. We have so much content and we have so much stuff to look at that we can spend all day just looking at content. And for other countries, they don't have as much. So, the way that I spread stuff virally or infectiously, let's just say in the Philippines, is very easy. Everyone does everything. So, you might, as you're building products and you have all this data, the Philippines they might just love everything you make, but your product still might not be that great. For the Philippines audience, it might be really great. So, if you take into account the United States and you take into account the Philippines, it's a different way of looking at your products because they're content starved and the United States is not content starved. And so you can look at it the same way for like Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, which is a big market as well. Brazil just recently came up as well. So the way that sort of Facebook is going in the space, companies like us are going the same way. The mobile space is going in the same direction. And so what we try to do is we try to take as much data as we can and think about the type of products that we want to build. So as I was explaining before, the amount of growth that's been happening, I want to say in the last 2 years, it's just exponential. During the time frame around 2005, 2006, you would see the amount of users on Facebook. And I'm going to be very specific to Facebook as a network because it's the easiest one to talk about, and it's probably the one that has the most data that's going to be relevant for this audience as well. Most of Facebook's growth happened in the United States first, and then once they figured out how to grow in certain areas, they grew in the areas that I specified earlier, which was Mexico, UK, what we in the Silicon Valley call English-speaking countries. So UK, Australia, Canada, United States. And then it sort of grew from there. Asia became a pretty big hub as well. And the type of data that we got, again, was different in every single country. In Asia, they had a tendency to spread no matter if they were male or female, between the ages of 18 and 25. In the United States, it's mostly female. I don't want to say that men are sort of irrelevant here in the United States, but they have I guess by nature they're very introvert here in the United States, and so they're not as outgoing, whereas females tend to share a lot more. So when we're catering our products, we look at female products for the United States, and then we don't, in sort of countries, a good example I can give you is Turkey. It's sort of 50-50. Male and female sort of interact and share the exact same way. Same in the Philippines. India is very similar to the United States. I think they're sort of copying what's happening in terms of like females share more. Males are more introvert again. UK is also the same way. So this type of data gives us a lot of information around how we need to build our products, and also the type of products that we want to build, and how do we sort of quantify it and also qualify it towards our overall business needs. So I work for a company called Lol Apps. We're about 4 years old. We started on the Facebook platform. And to give you a little bit of background, we weren't making games first. What we started building were entertainment products. So how many of you guys have used any gifts or quizzes on Facebook? Okay. How many of you guys felt that's annoying? Well, that's all us. So we have the largest network on Facebook after Zynga, and it's a combination of gifts, quizzes, phrases, but it might be annoying for you guys. Of course, we're trying to always evolve the product, and as the platform has evolved, we changed the way that we're also building the products to be more quality-oriented. And it's also based on feedback. The way that you might answer a quiz or create your own quiz changes the way that we build our products for the future. And the amount of data that you give us also changes the way that we think about you as a person or you as a community. And so today on Facebook, we have about 1 million applications that exist. We have the most amount of applications on Facebook, and then we have the most amount of users in that network. And that really helps solidify us to try to figure out what type of games that we wanted to build and the audience that we wanted to build for. Typically for just social games, it's female is sort of the majority of the audience across the board internationally if you look at it from an average perspective. The amount of gifts that we've sent since we started are about 12 billion gifts, and that continues to rise. It's a very exponential number. I would assume that by the end of this year, we'll hit about 15 to 20 billion gifts. And that's just the amount of information that people share. This is really important because this is actually, going back to what I was talking about from communication, this is how users communicate on Facebook. They send gifts to each other. They send requests to each other, and they want to find a way to share stuff. Has anybody ever sent e-cards to people via email? It's essentially the same concept by sending like pokes or sharing stuff on walls on Facebook. Just think of the way that users interact on Facebook. And that's like a steroids version of what you would send like an e-greeting card. It's just, these are interactions that happen every single day, and they happen at an exponential rate, and they happen faster and faster and faster. And it's a way that people feel tapped in. A good explanation was when I was at a previous conference, someone had talked about what this all really means is that if you are, like, let's just say this conference, ends, at the end of this day, a way that some people communicate are, by creating a group about this conference and continue the communication and continue that. Some people might make an application about this conference. I think that might be going a little overboard. But some people might actually create a group and just talk about like what's been happening and how things have been evolving. And what happens is that this conversation doesn't stop. And so you can think about it the same way, is that every communication, every application, every entertainment philosophy that you look at that's happening on any of these networks happens through these communications, which is gifts, pokes, likes, what you're doing outside of Facebook and how that correlates back into Facebook, and how do you communicate that to your friends. Does anybody familiar with the Open Graph API on Facebook? Sort of what you like, what you don't like? Okay. All that information that you are when you like something on when you like something outside of Facebook, let's just say on CNN, that you're essentially sharing that with your closed network or your friend network on Facebook. Facebook has that data. Your friends have that data, and any applications or products that you've installed on Facebook has that data. And then when we see that data, what you like, what you don't like, we have a good idea of what we're doing in terms of, like, again, creating our product, how you're going to interact with products over the time frame, and how you sort of changed your behavior in like the last, let's just say, year. So in the traditional space, in like 5 years ago when we were building products, your behavior would change over a course of a year. Now people's behaviors change in a course of minutes to hours to weeks. So the way that we have to build products ends up becoming from a product life cycle from minutes to hours to weeks. So as a company, we do weekly cycles, which are our major releases, but we release every single day. We make different changes to the product. We make new features to the product because people are interacting with our products at a very rapid pace, which makes it frustrating but exciting at the same time. Has anybody heard the concept of data-driven versus data-informed? Okay. So in our space, a lot of what we I don't want to say grew up, but sort of culturally we went in a direction was that we need to be reactive to data, and then we need to be driven by that data, and then we need to cater to our users. And over time, we sort of changed that philosophy, and it's mostly because if we keep reacting to the data of what our users are doing, that means we're going to go wherever the users want us to go, instead of thinking about what's our ultimate goal and vision of the product or the message that we want to send out. And so what we do today is we take a lot of these factors, which is what are the interests of the users, what's our business interest. In my space, we're trying to figure out how to make money. So we need to figure out what the users like and dislike in terms of how they interact with the products, and so that we can essentially charge them microtransactions and costs. What's our strategic goal in terms of what we're trying to create as a product? My company is a little bit different from the other ones that are out there. Zynga makes game by game by game. We're trying to create a network of a multitude of games, but they're all interconnected, and I'll talk about that towards the end. And how are these all important? So we're more, instead of reactive, we're more proactive, is that we take this data and we say, what can we do with it, and how can we sort of evolve the product and say 6 months from now we want our users to be here. What can we do to make them go in that direction? I'm saying this all at a high level. It can get a little bit more complicated, but there's just so much data about what the users are doing, how they're coming into the system. If you continue to just react to what they're doing, you end up looking like, I'm not going to name any products that are out there today, but you end up looking like a very discombobulated company or vision, and there are other companies out there that has sort of gone that route, and they're going through the frustrations today. So this is our game, Ravenwood Fair. It's a sim game. Essentially, it's a Snow White and Seven Dwarfs type Disney style game. If you want to say that's a style, just for everyone to sort of recognize it. We have about 25 million users across all networks. That's not just on Facebook, but Japan, in China, we're just about to launch Orchid, which is based in Brazil. So again, we have a global community, and then we have our games and applications. We sort of react to all those communities in a different way. So the products are very different in those regions. About 50% of our audience is international, and that's just everywhere outside. When I say international, that's everyone outside English-speaking countries. One of our largest audiences are in the Middle East and Asia. Middle East more so because they spend more, and they spend a lot more time in the games, whereas the Asian countries, they spend a lot more time in the games, but they spend less money in the games themselves. And that has to do with a lot of factors. It's not that they don't want to pay, it's just that there's a lot of payment mechanisms that just don't exist over there. And lastly, going back to the data, when we launched Ravenwood Fair, we were able to sort of decipher that information. Again, we just had an unprecedented amount of information about just how the gamers reacted. And what we ended up doing was we saw how the users were very content-starved and very story-driven, and that's how sort of the Facebook games have evolved over time. And so we decided to create something similar to what World of Warcraft is, but on Facebook, and it's a very different philosophy. But has anybody played World of Warcraft here? Cool. So the gamer base, what we sort of define on Facebook, is about 300 million users. It's about half the Facebook population. And that's our sort of target audience at the end of the day. And again, that consists of global audience, that consists of the U.S. audience, and they all also interact with each other very closely. And so the way that we're building it is that if you look at the picture up here, it's that each and every section is sort of its own application. This is just a sketch of what we're going for, but this is what the audience thinks they're going to be seeing, that they're going to be traveling from one area to the next based on either myth, lore that we come up with, and then they install this application, and then they interact with that. And then the genres can be from building your own castle to building your own fair, or going on a story quest around sort of, prince, princess, saving the princess, etc. And so that's how we look at the space. This is what we do on Facebook and on other networks. It's very complicated but very exciting at the same time. And then I'm more than happy to answer any questions in the meantime. So feel free. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
What kind of plan do you use? Agile or Scrum or?
It's a combination of a lot. A lot of people throw out the word agile development, lean development. They will also say Scrum development. It's essentially, at the end of the day, it's a combination of all. We have very small teams, and then those teams sort of react to data in a different way. So there's some teams that will react to just retaining, what we call retention internally. Some games are very some teams are growth focused. So they all have their specific skill sets around what they're looking for and how they're going to improve the game. And then we just focus on those specific stats that are coming in and saying, like, again, what's the vision of the game and where is it going?
If you guys could go to the microphones to ask the questions, that way the people watching on video can hear the questions, or if you want to repeat them.
I'll just shout it out.
Sure.
You guys, how important is music? How do you acquire it?
So.
Music in the game. Could you repeat the question then?
Sure. He asked how important is music and how do we acquire it, and specifically the music in the game. So when we first started on Facebook, music didn't matter at all. And again, I think it's just about how the audience evolves over time, and then how and what kind of content they have, right? As more competition comes, as the production quality changes, as the way they interact, graphics, etc. They're asking for more of that quality. So I want to say a year ago, music probably wasn't very important. It's just something in the background. Today, it's very important in terms of it's not something that we can measure. So when I go back to data informed versus data driven, if I was data driven, music, there's no way to measure like how music gets affected in my game and how important it is. But from a qualitative aspect, we know that as we've changed music and higher quality or music interaction within the game, like the way that you place your building or the way that your character interacts with that building, the music might change. So it's very important. And then the way that we acquire it is just we create it ourselves. Go ahead.
Obviously, you guys have like tens of millions of users for your games.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of strategies for marketing did you use to reach that? Did you just create the game and hope that people join it? Did you do kind of an ongoing thing where you reached out to particular networks saying, hey, check this out?
Sure. So his question was that we have tens of millions of users in our system. How did we get those users? What were the strategies that we used? The user base that we have on Facebook today, we have about 100 million users total. And so the way that we grew that, there's just a variety of different ways. But at a high level, we grew it organically, and we grew it through the techniques that I had talked about earlier, which was how do you identify specific key influencers? How do you get them to spread the word? The products grew organically first, which are the non-games. Over time, as the games came on, they're inherently a little bit less, when I want to say infectious and viral, but you have to try to figure out a way for them to grow. And so you still use the same techniques, and you still try to find those specific users that are very share-oriented. So again, specific countries that are very, very share-oriented are Philippines. The southern part of the United States is very share-oriented for games. It's a younger audience. So what we'll do is we'll target customers or users between the age of 16 to 25, mostly females. And they share a lot. They won't pay a lot, but they share a lot. And then they'll share with the next group, which is like 25 to 35, and then there's another group, 35 to 45. And again, this is all female-oriented. And so that's sort of how the game grows. And then you have to be very specific about how you target those users so that if you are going to be spending money, that you're measuring that, and then you're following their nodes that, as I explained before.
What kind of mechanisms do you use for payment, and how do you allow your users to kind of use them more impulsively so you can encourage them to participate?
Sure. So his question was, what type of payment mechanisms do we use? Sorry, what was the other part of the question?
Oh, yeah. How do you have users encourage them to be more impulsive with their kind of like purchasing and stuff? You talk about like Asia versus the Middle East and how some they pay more or less.
Sure. And then the other part was how do we make the users more impulsive to pay? That's a great question, and that's changed dramatically over time. So when we first started, payments was a major pain on Facebook, and it's a global society. So and the way that people take payments, it's very different. So in the United States, credit card is very it's everywhere, and so everyone uses it. In Germany, it's not. People use their bank SWIFT code. In the Philippines, people use an SMS payment to their carrier. Carriers in those countries take 80% of the revenue, right? So we had to do different techniques. There's a system called offers, basically, where users could get a certain amount of currencies in the game, which is actually how we all monetize, and I should probably talk about that. And then we can offer some of those currencies to them based on them signing up for Netflix or signing up for specific ringtones. There's just a lot of other things as well, or sending flowers during Mother's Day. You'll get a certain amount of credits in the game, and then those companies will pay us. So there's different payment mechanisms. Again, every country is different, and every offer in those countries is different. So I'll talk about the United States first. About 2 years ago, we just used to use the credit card system. And then over time on Facebook, they've created their own currency called Facebook Credits. And then they have their own payment mechanisms, which use PayPal, credit card. And then they've gone about going in every country so that we don't have to do that work. Which is Taiwan, they have their own gamer card system, Turkey gamer card system as well. And so it's a lot of prepaid amount. It's like an ATM card at the end of the day. It's like a prepaid debit card. They pay a certain amount of money for it. And then they register it when they're playing our game, and then they put in the code, and then they just say that this is the amount that they want to pay. The impulsive part has changed a lot. When we first started, items could cost from $5 to $30. Now they cost from 10 to 50 cents. And to make it more impulsive, what we do is we start charging people as little as possible, right in the beginning of the game, so they don't feel like the game is very expensive. And if they really like the game, then over time we'll ramp them up at a higher cost. At a higher price point. It really depends on the user base. There are some games out there that start off at the hundreds of dollars, and there's some games that start off at 10 cents. We specifically start off around 10 cents.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about A/B testing, the data-driven approach,
Sure.
and the experimentation that I'd imagine that you do, and that I'm aware that Zynga does.
Sure.
And whether you could say how that's informing you about the users.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I'll try to take a specific set. Are people familiar with what A/B testing means or split testing means? Essentially, what we're doing is we're trying to take one variable and say, like, here's a constant variable, and you want to change one feature and see how that, which is another variable, and see how that changes sort of the overall health or the overall scope of what we're trying to do, and what we can change. So one might be like, if I have a certain amount of users in the Philippines, and let's just say for every user that's in the Philippines, they invite 10 or they invite 1. That might change depending on sort of the way that we have a flow structure in our game. But once we change that flow or we test that flow, we'll see if they invite 1 or they invite less than 1 or over 10. Again, it depends. Specifically around A/B testing, for the application space, non-games, I want to say the quantitative methods are much much easier because you're testing colors, you're testing how people react to a placement of a button. You might change it here and there. You might test 10% of your audience and see how they react. And you just get a massive amount of data because you have millions of users, so you can say, hey, this one works better than the other. So that's what A/B testing means at the end of the day. We do that constantly. In the games, we do that a little bit less because it's I'm not sure how to do it, and a lot of the guys that are much smarter than me at my company are still trying to figure out how to do it. But games, at the end of the day, it's qualitative. Like, even if you're making a movie or you're writing a book, there's a lot of creativity that goes into it. So you can't really A/B test creativity. So what you try to do is you try to find specific control variables within what you're trying to create to see what you can test and see how you can react to it. But at the end of the day, if you're trying to make a good game, it has to be good, and then you can make tests after that. But it's very hard to sort of test and say, like, is this game going to be good right from the beginning? I think that's what you were trying to ask. We don't do any A/B testings around how to build a game, but we will do A/B testing around like the type of creatives that work versus what don't work. So we might create, like when we just tested Ravenwood Fair, like the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs style of buildings versus something that looked very, let's just say SimCity style. Has anybody played Cityville on Facebook? That style of building is very different, right? It's very modern looking. So test those types of things and seeing what works, what doesn't. And if something has a higher conversion rate the amount of people that click and want to come into the system, then you'll end up going in that direction. But again, those are just specific examples.
I think we're going to do these 2 questions, and then we'll have to wrap up this section.
Okay, actually, that last answer segues nicely into my question. I know you worked with Brenda Brathwaite and John Romero on Ravenwood Fair,
Yep.
two designers that have decades of combined experience in the industry, but not specifically in the Facebook or social game space. And you've talked a bit about data-informed and data-driven development,
Mm-hmm.
but I'd love to hear about the challenges or conflicts that you face when you're trying to design game mechanics from a data-informed and data-driven perspective. So instances where perhaps you might have wanted to put something in a game,
Yeah.
but the data suggests not to.
Sure. So that's a great question, actually. We did have a lot of challenges. So the coming up with the game is the hardest part, right? And so what we did is we relied on traditional game mechanics and traditional game developers that are out there. And they came up with sort of a framework of what they wanted the game to be. And it ends up being the overall theme of what the game should be. So after they created that, we'll look at specific mechanics that have been working on Facebook, specific mechanics that are working outside of Facebook, and seeing how we can sort of bridge the gap. At the end of the day, in our space, product managers are like the owners of their own product, and game designers are the owners of the game, and they have to come together and work in. It was a bit of a challenge, but it was fun at the same time because they're learning sort of how we look at the space, again, from a quantitative aspect. what we've learned already over time. We don't want history to repeat itself, make mistakes. And whereas they come from a very instinctive background, which is like, this would be fun. So there was a lot of mishmash and there was a lot of headbutting, but at the end of the day, what happens is that you have to be happy with what you're coming out with. And then as soon as you release it out there and you have tens and millions of users playing in the game, you know what you did wrong and what you did right. A great example I can give you is just the way that the buildings were placed when you were buying it in a store, or the way that people were leveling up in the curve. We thought it might be better if we made it more expensive, for higher level users, but it ended up happening was that it was too expensive at like a specific level, going from like level 5 to level 6. So from a data perspective, that helped us, saying that a lot of the users from level 5 to level 6 stopped playing the game because it was way too hard, right? So, but a person that's playing a game or started creating this game, if they weren't looking at the data and if they were going by pure instinct, would not realize that.
Last question.
You mentioned a couple of countries and regions that where users are particularly engaged.
Mm-hmm.
Could you comment on how Latin America compares, excluding Brazil, in terms of user engagement and level of participation?
Sure. Excluding Brazil, I would say Mexico and Argentina are probably like the largest populations that play the game. They also react very, very, very differently. I'll probably talk about Mexico a little bit more. So when we come out with a game in English, they don't care. It doesn't make a big difference for them, and they don't interact in the game in the same way. So when I was talking about A/B testing, when we measure the conversion of how many users are playing the game in Mexico, when we translate it and localize it into their language versus when we had it in English, it's a vast difference. The moment we change the game into Spanish in the way that, basically we're more thoughtful about how they interact with the game and their culture, and then we change the game in accordance with that. They engage much, much higher, and they ended up engaging in the game much higher than the people that are playing it sort of like in the southern tip of the United States and in the coastal areas. And so, they interact with the game they interact in the game very differently than what I would say the traditional users that interact here in the United States. Again, the traditional users here in the United States are like 35 and up female. Over there, it's a younger audience. It's skewed more towards younger, and I think it's because they're more sort of infatuated, and they're also, when I talk about self-expression and social network, they're the ones that are just more in tune with that, whereas like the fastest growing populations for social network in the United States is above 50, and over there, the fastest growing population is between 18 and 25. I think it just really depends on that population. So they spend a lot of time in the game. They spend a lot less. But Latin America is a big focus for us in the long term. Thank you.